Okay, so this week we're going to discuss what is culture, and I'm actually just going to show you the soft chalk, and we'll talk through it this week. Just trying to make it a little bigger. So this checklist, of course, you always have to do the learning objectives and make sure that you go through the Start Here module. It's a lot to do, but you should get through it, which includes first things first. And course objectives, those are the quizzes that you need to take by Monday. You're going to read the focus questions as usual, and I have embedded a PDF of the chapter on culture that I'd like you to read. And you'll read, of course, through the soft chalk and watch the video, which you're doing now. I click on the links throughout as usual and articles, and you need to make sure that you do the voice thread for this week. I know there's a lot this week, but if you can make it through this week, I always say, then it just lets me know that you can handle the rest of the course. It's not so much all the time, but we got to get started with a bang. So if you haven't already, purchased The Shape of Things, and make sure you go ahead and start reading it for next week. So this is a way you can navigate through SoftChalk. Just click on next page. And then these are the learning objectives for the week. Differentiate between culture and society. And actually, I'm going to come back to these. But these are the learning objectives for this week. And we'll see how they relate. The assessment is to do those quizzes and the voice thread for this week. And then I just have a photo here already getting you started on culture, that this is considered maybe a homosexual behavior in our culture. But, you know, if you read the chapter, which you should do, not so much is it considered that. I just want to make sure. I know I'm going backwards. There's another way you can navigate is just go through the pages at the top. So on page 4, toward the bottom of the page, at the bottom of the page is the chapter. You can download it by clicking here and downloading. You can print it if you need to, or you can just read it there. I can't get it back. Okay, I was just trying to show you. You can also make it bigger. Let me just show you. Scroll down and read the whole thing that way, or you can click down with your mouse, read it that way. You can go next page this way. Okay. So what is culture? Again, I'm going to come back to this because I think the thing we kind of need to get started with is learning some vocabulary before we can understand what we're talking about. So commonly used vocabulary and culture. I have these pictures here because they represent a huge part of culture that we talk about, and that is symbols, gestures or objects that have meaning associated with them that are recognized by the people of that culture. So for instance, we know this to be a yield sign. Maybe if you went to this Asian country and saw this, you would know to yield, but we can't read that, so we don't necessarily know what that means. So that's one of the reasons why some things don't need the words. We know that means good that people can walk down there. Cultural relativism is the belief that all countries should be judged by your country's standards. This is important, and we'll talk about it because a lot of times, especially we as Americans, or just in general, people think that. For instance, polygamy is illegal in the United States of America, but in many cultures in the world, it is a norm, which we'll talk about. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we as Americans know it to be. So that's cultural relativism, an example at least. Culture shock is something that you probably are experiencing now going through college. It's a disorientation that is felt when encountering a radically different culture. And the norms are the behaviors that are considered appropriate or normal and accepted in that society. Here's an important word. I'm going to actually skip to another one while we're talking about it, and that's xenocentrism, a word we hear a lot during actually this presidential debate now, is the belief that another culture is superior to one's own, or one specific culture is superior. So oftentimes we'll hear that, for instance, in terms of xenocentrism in the United States, that European Americans are superior, and even people who are not European Americans would maybe believe this, and it's not necessarily true. It goes hand in hand with ethnocentrism. That's the word I was skipping to. The practice of judging all other cultures by one's own culture based on the assumption that one's own way of life is superior to all others, and it can be positive or negative. So, for instance, there's nothing wrong with being proud of your culture, but sometimes it can be to an extent where the person may think that other cultures are negative or bad, or they become hateful towards other cultures. So I'm back up here again, go through the rest of them. High culture is what you'll pretty much be learning when, in terms of, if you were to take music appreciation or art appreciation, or even in this course in terms of theater, it's taste and creations used by the upper class versus pop culture, which is taste and ideas that appeal to the masses, popular culture. So when we hear pop music, that's what that means. It's for popular culture. Diffusion is the spread of material and non-material culture from one culture to another. Globalization is the integration of international trade and finance markets. Counterculture, subculture, and microculture. Again, all these kind of go hand in hand. Counterculture is a group that strongly rejects dominant societal values and norms and seeks alternative lifestyles. An example that is used is hippies of the 1960s and 70s. A subculture is a society in which they are embedded. These characteristics may be a set of ideas and practices of some demographic similarity. So, for instance, hippies are an example of a subculture, but not all subcultures are a counterculture. You are experiencing a subculture of, for instance, college students. It is a subculture because everyone in the United States or even in the world is not in college, but it's a culture that's very specific that you understand, and it's not necessarily against the norm. Versus a microculture, which share distinguishing characteristics but tend to be more closely linked to the larger group, often serving in mediating roles. More specifically, there's a microculture of Kennesaw State students. So even though you all experience what it is to be in college, it's something very specific to be in college at Kennesaw State. Again, the next three kind of go hand in hand: ethnic groups, minority groups, and people of color. Members of an ethnic group share a common heritage, a common history, and often a common language. And oftentimes there is a loyalty to one's ethnic group, and it can be powerful. People often get ethnic groups confused with race. If, for instance, there is not necessarily an ethnicity of black or white. There's more so an ethnicity of an African American versus a South African or a Nigerian. They're still all black, but not necessarily of the same culture. They might have some similarities, but that's that similarities of that ethnic and not necessarily the race. There's oftentimes it can be even argued that there's no such thing as race, because what you experience is really about your ethnicity. Again, why within the last few years we've heard people come out to say, oh, I belong to this ethnic group or I belong to that ethnic group, and they might not have any DNA to prove such, but that's what they believe based on how they live their life. So that is an ethnic group, and even in terms of Europeans, there's an ethnic group of Irish or Russian or Italian. So those are ethnic groups. Those are specific understandings of way of life. Versus a minority group, which, and not necessarily say versus, because a minority group could be an ethnic group, and that's a group of people who are a subordinate position in society. They may be separate from the dominant society by disapproval and discrimination. It doesn't necessarily have to be a racial or ethnic group. It can also be, for instance, the people that belong to LGBTQ, which is lesbian, bisexual, gay, transgender, and questioning. That's considered a minority group because that's not the majority does not necessarily ascribe to that. People of color is a term referred to members of people who are non-white. And it is very important. You might hear that word. It's not necessarily a negative word as long as it's said correctly, people of color. Colored is not a word that we still use in today's society, but people of color represents pretty much anyone who's non-white. Okay. So there's a picture here that says, why might this map be considered ethnocentric? Look at it. It's a map of the world, but notice what's in necessarily the middle of the world and how we might view it. And then culture solves common human problems because it allows us to communicate through language. It's a determination of power through status, a regulation of reproduction and with the family. It is a system of rules with the government. It helps with our relationship to nature. For instance, understanding if there's such thing as magic or myths or religion or science. Those all are part of our culture. Concept of time and temporality, all of that is part of culture. For instance, when I was in South Africa, and you might experience this even with your culture, I found that most cultures have this saying of, in Africa, they'll say, oh, we're going by African time. And even the saying of when the cows come home. So they're not necessarily, rushed to get anywhere. They don't use a clock necessarily all the time. It's just when we get around to it. And it's not a bad thing like in our culture where we have to be somewhere on time. And that term, when the cows come home, literally means if the cows are walking down the street and you can't get past them, you pretty much have to wait till they get home before you can get past them and move on with your day. Significant lessons in history are all part of our culture, and how we view history is part of our culture. I'll look at, for instance, our United States history, and oftentimes we started with George Washington, but we forget that this country was the Native Americans were here long before Christopher Columbus, and it's not necessarily something that we really discuss much. We breeze past it in our history lessons, and it's the same thing even for the negative things that have happened in our United States history, slavery and internment camps, and the list goes on and on. So we might learn about it, we might not. If we do, sometimes it gets breezed past, but that's part of kind of the American culture to think of history in a certain way. And if we were in another country, we would think of history in a different way. Cultural representations also include music, story, dance, and art. So the arts are a part of culture. The arts in Europe look different from the arts in Africa, and we'll talk about that when we talk about what is art. All of that's part of cultural representation. So I also want you to know when you're looking at soft chalk, you can also navigate through soft chalk at the top with, I think we got through page 3. You can also navigate at the bottom, next page. So at the bottom of this page, I believe it's 4, is the chapter. And at the top is things that you might want to consider reading so you can better understand the chapter before you read the chapter. This is guiding and focus questions. And then also consider, while we're discussing culture, and as we move on to next week when we read a play that is significant in culture and art and theater, all of the things we'll be talking about in the next coming weeks, think about how art and specifically theater, performance and theater, help us understand cultural differences. What is the criteria by which a piece of art, performance, or theater is defined, assessed, or evaluated? How do we acquire culture, which we'll talk about? How and why is culture necessary for understanding art, performance, and theater? What is the criteria by which culture define themselves? What is the criteria by which you define yourself? What are the inherent beliefs of culture being shared, and what are the sources of identity? How is culture passed on? Again, we'll talk about. And does art and performance and theater play a role in this process? So, like I said, we'll talk about those things. You'll be reading about those things, but I also want you to form your own opinions. When defining culture, it is socially constructed. It is shared by members. It is both objective and subjective, which we'll get to, and it is defined by geography, ethnicity, language, religion, history, and other important social characteristics, and it is socially transmitted. So again, a lot of times it is compared to an iceberg. There are things in culture that we see. Food is part of culture, and we'll talk about that. Music, literature, those are things that are we can tangible, we can touch, dress, how we look, all of that's part of our culture, versus the things that we necessarily don't see on the outward appearance, but are definitely a part of the culture, how males and females treat each other and are treated differently and are expected to act. Etiquette and assumptions and beliefs and norms and rules, expectations, values, all of those things are part of cultures, and that is represented in objective versus subjective ideas of culture. So, since we're talking about objective versus subjective, again, those objective are tangible things, things that you can touch, physical artifacts, language, clothing, food, and decorative objects, versus subjective things that you might think differently of, attitudes, values, norms of behavior, social rules, meaning, or objective cultural elements, meaning that we talked about cultural norms. If I think that it's normal to I used the example before of if you had several husbands or wives, and another person might think that's okay. Or, for instance, using an example of a woman. In some cultures, the women might be considered submissive, and to another culture, they might be considered humble or understanding or kind or being very pious and religious, or even independent. But it's subjective. It depends on how you view things. So material culture is the physical or tangible see and touch that members of society make, use, and share. And it starts with the raw material and it becomes technology into actual things. And that's, for instance, the material culture of Americans. Again, I use us as an example often because we can understand our culture and then use that to compare to others. We use jeans. We use smartphones. Those are things that have started from raw materials that technology has made into stuff that we feel like we have to have or part of our material culture. So, for instance, it uses this example of raw materials made into a zipper and how diffusion takes place with the material product of that zipper. Non-material cultures are the abstract or intangible human creations of society that influence people's behavior, like language, beliefs, values, rules of behavior, family patterns, and political systems. And then the cultural process is what makes you who you are. The places and things that make you who you are and how you describe yourself. So because of how you went to school and your family and technology and the arts and the sports that you do and the community you're from, all of that help shape you into who you are. And when you say who you are, then you explain it through those parameters. Oh, I'm a middle-aged African-American female who speaks English and middle class and Christian. And I'm heterosexual. All of those things would describe me, and the list goes on and on when you think of who you are. Yeah, I'm giving you an example of some things, of some parts of who I am. Please, please, please watch this video. This is a TED Talk, a pretty famous TED Talk, and you might know this young lady, Shamanda Adichie. I think I said her name correctly. Beyonce uses her when discussing feminist behavior. So you might have heard her work through Beyonce's work, but this is not that. This is her doing a TED Talk about the danger of the single story, where she explains how being African shaped how she thought of, for instance, Americans or people in other parts of the world, and how when she went to other parts of the world, how that shaped those people into thinking who she is, and how important this will go hand in hand. So much we'll talk about throughout the semester, and as you develop your own story for the end of the semester. So consider, please watch it and understand, when she talks about her culture and how culture is important in shaping how we look at people, but we should not let it, we shouldn't look through it with a single lens, and be open-minded. And then you have already done a lecture video. You should be proud of yourself. If you see the PDF and the ADA versions, you don't need to do all of that, just one of them. The culture of excellence is what we want for our class. So consider how we can make this culture of excellence. You're going to read this PDF, and then you're going to discuss on the VoiceThread. But I want you to think, how can we make this a great class? And that's what is expected, because that's the norm of our classroom. And again, that's how you look at the PDF. And then always at the end of every topic or sources and acknowledgments. Have a great week. This is a lot, but it's interesting stuff. So good luck.